Allora, buonasera, benvenute e benvenuti. Sono molto contenta, insomma, di inaugurare il ciclo di seminari di traduzione letteraria inglese con il professore Massimiliano Morini, che a breve presenterò. Di fatto loro sono le studentesse e gli studenti del terzo anno del corso di mediazione linguistica ed interculturale e vi sono anche studentesse e studenti del corso di magistrale, insomma, quindi abbiamo una presenza importante perché chiaramente questo ciclo di seminari è rivolto a tutti gli studenti, ma prioritariamente a coloro che quest'anno seguono proprio un corso di Translation Studies, teorie, pratiche e chiaramente laboratori. La formula di quest'anno, come sapete, prevede 4 incontri, di cui, o meglio 8 incontri, di cui 4 seminari e 4 laboratori, per cui ogni docente invitato e invitata illustrerà nel seminario la parte teorica e quindi un'illustrazione, un overview del contesto, del testo, del genere testuale che sarà oggetto di analisi, da cui il titolo appunto dei vari incontri, come da locandine che avrete visto online e che vedrete in sede al più presto. E quindi, ripeto, ogni incontro avrà appunto un primo seminario teorico e poi un laboratorio applicativo, che è chiaramente la parte, come dire, in cui sarete invitate ed invitati ad entrare nel workshop di riferimento dei colleghi e delle colleghe che sono non solo massimi esperti del settore della traduzione letteraria e delle teorie traduttive, come nel caso del professore Morini, ma anche traduttori che ci illustreranno, sostanzialmente ci faranno entrare proprio nel vivo del loro workshop. Prima di chiaramente introdurre il collega, vorrei ricordare che questo evento è stato sostenuto dal Centro Studi per la Traduzione e abbiamo oggi la direttrice del centro con la quale abbiamo molto interloquito anche nei mesi scorsi, proprio in fase, diciamo, di ideazione di questa linea progettuale, per cui Giulia Marcucci, docente di lingua e letteratura russa, che ringrazio vivamente per il sostegno.
Allora, buonasera a tutte e tutti. Io ringrazio in verità la professoressa Silvia Antosa e sono molto contenta di questa collaborazione tra 2 centri della nostra università, ovvero il CLAS, diretto dalla professoressa Antosa, e il Centro Studi sulla Traduzione, che ha una vita breve, ma ce la stiamo mettendo tutta per organizzare incontri, seminari, convegni, scuole estive di traduzione, proprio mirate, focalizzate quindi in particolare, ma non solo, alla traduzione letteraria. Ed è molto bello che questo incontro con il professor Massimiliano Morini, traduttore, oggi qui presente per appunto per parlare della sua traduzione e rivivere la sua traduzione con tutti voi. È molto bello appunto che questo incontro sia organizzato in connessione di 2 centri, a riprova dell'importanza per il nostro Ateneo della traduzione letteraria e anche della pratica della traduzione, cioè con la speranza che questa attività complessa, affascinante, intrigante possa poi accompagnarvi anche nella vostra carriera futura. E non a caso stiamo anche ideando un dottorato in studi di traduzione. Quindi vi auguro buon lavoro sia nella parte più di ascolto delle riflessioni sul processo traduttivo di Massimiliano Morini, sia nella parte più pratica del vero e proprio laboratorio traduttivo. Grazie.
Grazie infinite per questa, diciamo, prima di tante future connessioni, e la professoressa Marcucci al CEST, il Centro Studi sulla Traduzione. Provvedo adesso a presentare, I'll switch to English. So I'm very glad to introduce Professor Morini, who teaches English linguistics and translation at the University of Urbino Carlo Bo. His research interests include translation history, theory and practice, as well as literary and multimodal stylistics. His articles on early modern translation and linguistics have appeared on several important and prestigious translation journals all over the Anglophone world, such as Taxus, Germanic Philology, Philological Quarterly, and so on, and many others. And as a literary translator, he has worked on several important authors, such as William Shakespeare, R.S. Thomas, Les Murray, Lewis Grassic Gibbon, William Boyd, Claire Keegan, and many others. Thank you for being here today, Massimiliano. I'm really glad to have you here and to get to know you. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm going to, you see here that we have a PowerPoint in Italian. I recycled some materials I used on a couple of occasions, always presenting Chaucer and medieval literary translation. By the way, I hate sitting down and talking because I like going at people, and it's very frustrating to not be able to do that, but we are also streaming this, so I have to use the microphone and so on. But know that this is frustrating for me, and be aware of the fact that if you would like to intervene, to say something, to protest anything, please do it. Any interventions will be welcome. I might at times also interrupt the talking and the streaming in order to try and involve you. You will probably resist that, but I have no problems being silent for minutes on end until someone talks. But anyway, as I was saying, you see that the PowerPoint here, can you hear me correctly? Because I hear a sort of slight feedback noise, una specie di ritorno minimo, ma se voi mi sentite vado benissimo. Okay, you see that the PowerPoint here is in Italian, and actually we didn't discuss, Silvia and I, whether this would be in Italian or in English until a few minutes ago. That is why the PowerPoint is in Italian, but we're going to speak in English. We decided that it was more sensible, because this, after all, is the Università per Stranieri di Siena, and there might be some non-Italian speakers here, to do this in English. Now, translating Chaucer. My translation was published last year for Feltrinelli. I am now working on Dickens, again for Feltrinelli, on Great Expectations, and on rereading both this book and my Dickens. I realized that on both occasions, without intending to, without meaning to, I opened my introductions essentially by asking why people should read the stuff I translate, why people, asking myself and asking readers, why people should read what I translate, why it makes sense or it doesn't make sense to propose a new translation of Chaucer and Dickens. Now, this probably has to do with a number of autobiographical considerations. Everything we do, everything we write, and everything we translate, the way we translate, is linked to the way we are. I tend to be a person who asks for permission and is never sure that people should pay attention to him. I don't have that sense of entitlement of people who think, okay, I'm going to talk and people are going to listen. So probably that has to do with that personal psychological quality. I opened the introduction by trying to convince people that it's worthwhile reading the translation. Partly it has to do with historical considerations. Very few people read in general in Italy, and fewer people, fewer and fewer younger people read today in the world in Italy. You clearly are exceptions, most of you, but in general, when I'm publishing a translation of a medieval author, that's very far from most of our experience, and of course, our linguistic experience in particular. I wonder who is ever going to read this? So that's another reason. The third reason, of course, is that there are other Chaucer translations, other Italian Chaucers. So one might say, why do you need to put out, to bring another Italian Chaucer into the world. And basically, I'm trying to answer, will be trying to answer that question today. Before trying to answer that question, I will anticipate a couple of things. One, well, of course, in this case, because Feltrinelli did not have a Chaucer, so there was a space there. Two, because they paid me. That's not bad. Not a lot, of course. You don't get paid a lot of money to translate poetry in relation to the quantity of work that you actually do. But it's nice. Three, well, because the other translations which were already there were different, and I was a bit dissatisfied with them, or rather, I thought that they did not represent all of Chaucer, that there were certain aspects which were not represented. So my idea was I want to add a layer to Italian Chaucer. I want to, or there is this possibility, something is missing. In my infinite self-esteem, might be the one who adds that layer. So that's a contradiction, but there are many people who are made like that. Lack of a sense of entitlement, infinite self-esteem. That might explain the Chaucer as well. Paradoxically, and this is another anticipation of what I'm going to say, when I reread my own Chaucer to present it to you, part of it, of course, I also thought, well, if I didn't know Middle English and I wanted to read Chaucer, to sort of decipher Chaucer by means of an Italian translation, I would probably not choose my own translation. So my translation is not for the likes of me, which is another paradox. Okay, so just to translate the title, which is voluntarily vague and confusing, this is going to be called I Baptize This New Chaucer, Translations, Declaratives, and False Dualisms. Okay, I teach translation as well as translating and working on translation history, theory, practice, the history of theory, etc. The fact that I am both a translator and a translator trainer, or rather the fact that I am both a translator trainer and a translation theorist / historian, poses a number of problems, or rather one big problem. My big problem is that I have to teach something, which means that I have to give people, students, a set of guidelines, rules, if you like, suggestions of various kinds, and I don't really believe in any of them. Why is that? Because I know the history of translation. And my first lesson when I teach translation at the University of Urbino is always a sort of condensed history of Western translation in an hour and a half. You may feel for those poor people who have to get that lesson. It's very packed, very compact. Of course, it doesn't go into any detail. It's a sort of very quick ride through a couple of millennia of human history. And by doing that, by looking at translation from let's say, the Greeks to today, so more than 2 millennia actually, and particularly by looking at what translation was, what was intended by the word translation or by cognate words, synonyms, let's say, like interpretation, interpretare, and so on. In certain periods, by looking at what it meant in certain periods, for instance, the period during which Chaucer wrote, you realize that translation can mean anything. Okay, I won't give you the condensed history of translation lesson here, but I will give you a single example drawn from Chaucer's age. Chaucer was called grand translateur by a French poet, by a contemporary, great translator. And basically 80% of what he did was translation. Even most of the Canterbury Tales are translation. Not the parts I translated, because mine is an edition of just the prologue and the epilogues, all the connecting parts, which to me are the funniest, the most interesting. Not the stories, but the parts between the stories. So those are not, generally speaking, there is something that is translation, but generally speaking, those are not translations, but most of the stories are. The other great work, the other great Chaucerian work is Troilus and Cressida, sorry. I used the Shakespearean version of the title. And Troilus and Cressida is a translation from Boccaccio. Only if you look at Boccaccio's poem and Chaucer's tragedy, as he called it, not a tragedy in our sense, but that's another translative question, if you like. But anyway, if you look at the two things, if you compare Boccaccio and Chaucer, and you judge those two texts in terms of what we think is translation and what I have to teach as translation, we moderns think that's not translation, that's not a translation, that's a new work that bears some resemblance with Boccaccio's source text. But that was a translation. That was what translation meant in the Middle Ages, in the European Middle Ages. The idea was that there were stories around, for instance, not just stories, but let's keep to stories. And you had perhaps the manuscript containing a certain number of stories at your disposal. And you wanted to translate them, you wanted to do your own version, maybe in another language. But if you didn't like the ending, for instance, you changed it. If you wanted to add something because you wanted to, I don't know, flatter a monarch, you did. If you wanted to change some of the details, you did. And that was still a translation. So when my students ask me, what do I have to do? I don't really have an answer, which is a problem when you're teaching something. I can't tell them how to translate. So my answer has to be tentative, and it has to be, it has to relate to pragmatics and to conscious decisions. My view of translation is connected with this historical notion, with this historical awareness. But of course, it's not mine alone. Translation studies as a discipline was born after the Second World War with the idea and the project of building, of creating perfect machine translation, of dispensing with humans. By the way, today Google Translate does good things, but we're not going to discuss Google Translate. The only way in which Google Translate is relevant to translation teaching and translating is that, as I tell my students, Google Translate is able to do this. You have to do something better. You have to write. You have to be able to write. Anyway, it was born in that way as a sort of scientific, hard science, mathematics-based science, exercised by information theorists and linguists with the idea of drawing a set of rules and transformation algorithms that would enable machines to translate ultimately. But then in the 70s, something changed, and translation science turned into translation studies. The emphasis changed. The idea in the 70s was no longer, this is a hard science, we're going to solve the problem of translation, but this is a descriptive science. We're going to look at what translation does in actual reality, at how translators behave, at how they have behaved through the centuries. I have a quotation from, a famous quotation from a series of books edited by Susan Basnet and André Lefebvre here, which says it all, though with a little emphasis, which I don't like, on ideology in a sort of embattled sense. But anyway, translation is, of course, a rewriting of an original text, or source text, as we should say today. All rewritings, whatever their intention, reflect a certain ideology and a poetics, and as such manipulate literature to function in a given society in a given way. Rewriting is manipulation undertaken in the service of power. I don't necessarily agree with this. You can manipulate something in the service of anything, not just power. And its positive aspect can help in the evolution of a literature and a society. So translation is rewriting. When we translate, we have to write. We need to have, and this is particularly relevant when dealing with Chaucer, a poetics. We need to decide what we're going to do. What I tell my students, I give them a couple of extra notions from 20th century translation and linguistic theory. One of them is the notion of skopos, which is a Greek word simply meaning aim, purpose. Very easy for us Italians to understand what skopos means. A word used by Ian Vermeer in the 70s and 80s to signify the fact that when people translate, they try to, let's say, follow and reproduce the aims, not only of the source text, but also to translate according to their own aims, to the aims of the target writer. So, again, that was another sort of sea change in how translation was viewed. I tell my students, you have to decide why you are translating, what kind of text you're trying to do. That, by the way, is what I'm going to tell you tomorrow. I will ask you not merely to begin translating, but to formulate a sort of a translation project. I'm going to ask you, what kind of Chaucer do you want to create? That's obviously a question that you've never asked yourselves, but you will have to ask it tomorrow. The other thing I say is you have to tell me, of course, what your purpose is. I used the term declarative translation here. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with speech act theory. Linguistic, one of the first theories, the founding theories within the sub-discipline of pragmatics. The title of Austin's book, in which speech act theory is formulated, is relevant and interesting here because it goes how to do things with words. Very famous book, 1962, How to Do Things with Words. So among the speech acts, I'm not using Austin's own terminology here, but Searle's terminology, as you see. One of the speech acts described by Austin, and in this case, Searle, is the declarative speech act. Again, the idea is that when we talk, we not only give information or express our feelings or thoughts, but we also try to do things explicitly or in a non-explicit manner. If I ask someone to open the window, either by saying, please open the window, or by saying, it's very hot in here, you know, I am trying to get that someone to do something. I am trying to direct him. That's called a directive, normally. A very interesting speech act is the declarative. Very interesting to linguists in particular, because it provides a sort of direct, immediate, and very strong link between language and reality. The declaratives in Searle's definitions are those utterances which really change reality. The kind of utterance that's illustrated by, for instance, I name this ship the Mr. Stalin. That's actually what's in the cover of Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words. Or I hereby, I don't know, pronounce you man and wife. Okay, that kind of thing. When I say that, I mean not die, but when the priest or whoever it is, or the mayor says that, reality changes. It's not exactly like that, but you get the sense of, you get why linguists are excited by that kind of thing. Language and reality suddenly married. So what I say to my students is you have to do a declarative translation. You have to tell me what you're trying to do. And then I will judge your translation according to your stated aims. And that sort of solves my problem on how to teach something for which I believe there are no fixed rules. You tell me what you're trying to do, I will judge the success of your translation according to what you wanted to do, which seems obvious, but is not in our world. Because most people do not want to think that a translation has aims. Most people want to think, I am buying this translation of Shakespeare. I don't know English, but by reading this translation, I am reading Shakespeare. And that's a problem to me. I mean, I'm by no means the first person to have said this. Very famous book called The Translator's Invisibility by Lawrence Venuti described the hunger for invisibility in the Anglo sphere, in the English-speaking world. The idea that, in his description, English and American readers want translations that do not show their status as translations, so that the readers will be able to deceive themselves into thinking, okay, I am reading the book as if it was the source, or in that case, the original. Now, what's the problem if you do that? I have an English and a German example here. What's the problem if you do that, if you don't declare your aims? Okay, brought two examples, two books which do not declare their aims. One of them is Christa Wolf's Geteilte Himmel, Il cielo diviso in italiano, a book from the ex-DDR, first published in 1963 and translated in Italian by Maria Teresa Mandalari. For some reason, translators, particularly women translators, I don't know why, tend to have double names, either double names or double surnames. It must be a requirement in the curriculum. Also some men, I don't know why. It makes the name look, I suppose, more dignified. And the other example is Alessandro Serpieri's famous 1991 edition of Shakespeare's sonnets. Now, none of these two books have declarations in them, in the sense in which I meant declarations. They don't tell you this is a translation that does this or that. There's nothing in Il cielo diviso. By the way, there is a postscript, c'è una postfazione. So there might have been some space to do that, to say this translation tries to bring out this or that in the source. And there is a lot of space here. There would have been a lot of space here to tell you this translation is done in the service of, in aid of, in order to bring out this or that. Because this book, I mean, the sonnets there occupy less space than the paratext. The paratext is anything that's not text, introduction, notes, everything. And the sonnets are sort of sandwiched between a very long introduction in Serpieri's edition and an incredible number of notes, 1 page of notes for every sonnet. So they are sort of dwarfed. Shakespeare himself is kind of dwarfed by Serpieri or Serpieri's apparatus. So there would have been a lot of space to say, okay, this translation is written in this manner. But he didn't, Serpieri didn't do that. You might say, well, but they tried to translate as well as they could, so why should they specify something? Well, the reason is that, again, there is no such thing as a neutral translation. Leaving aside the references to power and ideology, or ideology intended in that very restrictive political sense, I agree with Bassenet and Lefebvre here. So any translation either serves some purpose, is done in a definite, specific manner, and the translator knows, or, which is much more frequent, the translator does not know. The translator himself or herself likes to think that this is just as good a translation as can be done of this, or as good a translation as I can do of this, which is hopefully true, of course. Therefore, I don't need to say anything. I've done my best. I'm giving you my best. This is, to me, Shakespeare or Christa Wolf. Now, what happens normally if you don't ask yourselves questions on what you're doing is that you end up working in an unwitting, involuntary manner. As most people in your situation, in your country, under the pressure of certain societal norms would tend to do. the concept of norms, norme, translation norms, le norme traduttive, which I derive from Gideon Toury. I realize I should have had brought a. It's in the program. Okay, great. Fantastic. So Gideon Toury, you will surely have in the program his seminal book, Descriptive Translation Studies and Beyond, which sounds great, which sounds like science fiction. And he, I think, coined the term, or anyway, popularized the term translation norms, which does not mean what I need to tell my students to do. Norms are not rules. The difference between rules and norms is that rules, I break the rules if I go around in the street naked. They will arrest me. But I don't do that if I go around in the street with very colorful clothes. That's, I'm breaching a norm there. So people will simply look at me as if I'm mad. And I will probably be shunned by polite society or by society in general. So that's a norm in sociological terms. So when we translate, what happens if we don't ask ourselves, how am I going to translate this, is that we tend to instinctively fall into those preordained furrows. We will tend to write, and I again stress write, and also translate in ways which are typical of our group or nation. For example, we might try, that's a norm in itself, to insist on the fact that our translation is as invisible, as transparent as possible, that we are not really translating. If you look at what translators who are not translators, translation theorists write about their own careers, sometimes famous translators in Italy as well, get to write their own translator autobiography. People like Susanna Basso, for instance. They're very good translators, but when they try to define what they do, they always do that in terms of, I try to be as faithful as possible to my text, which is nonsense, utter nonsense. Of course, you try not to deceive people into thinking that, I don't know, Mein Kampf is not against Jewish people. But the simple notion of faithfulness means absolutely nothing. So what happens in Italy when we translate and we are not thinking, well, I'm going to try to do this or that, is that we normally fall into one or two pitfalls. We tend to abide by a couple of typical norms, particularly when we translate classical texts or texts which have a certain cultural weight, what Bourdieu would call cultural capital. There are books, just as there are films or music albums or anything, which if you wear them, again, in polite and cultured society, they make you look good. If you say that you've read War and Peace, that's good. You may not have liked it, but the fact that you read it is a good thing for you, for your CV, let's say, for your self-presentation. And when we translate those books, we tend to well, in the first place, we tend to keep to the syntax and morphology of the text almost to the letter, which creates a certain kind of text. Serpieri's sonnets are all like that. By the way, I'm not saying that these translations are not legitimate or interesting. I'm just saying, I will repeat this, but I want to be specific from the very beginning, because otherwise it might seem as if I'm criticizing Serpieri and Mandalari. Well, Mandalari is pretty bad, but Serpieri and Mandalari as they're both dead, so we can say whatever we like about them. Unfortunately, I mean, I miss Serpieri. I had a couple of very funny arguments, interesting arguments with him in the, at the beginning of the 21st century. At the beginning of the 20th century would have been interesting with Serpieri and T.S. Eliot back in Zurich with Pound. Okay. I'm not saying these are bad translations. As a matter of fact, if I had to read Shakespeare and didn't know English, I would probably choose Serpieri's translation. I would not like to do that kind of translation. I would feel very bored doing that translation, but I recognize the value of the translation. My problem is with the edition, which does not tell you this translation works in this way. And the way in which it works is I'm using two terms which are used by Paola Venturi in an article on the translator's immobility, English modern classics in Italy. If you're interested, it's on Target. One of them actually is originally from Antoine Berman, Enoblissement, Nobilitazione, ennobling. Immobility describes one of the norms that I have in mind. When people translate the classics, modern classics in Italy, they tend to keep to the syntax and morphology. They tend to preserve as much as possible the word order, and if possible to translate a noun with a noun, a verb with a verb, adverb with adverb, and so on. Which makes for, of course, very awkward and quite un-Italian Italian. Rudi venti scuotono I diletti boccioli del maggio. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Same syntax, okay, that do cannot be reproduced. But apart from that, it's the exact same syntax. Darling is diletti, so he decides not to translate it as, for instance, teneri, which might have kept both the tenderness and the brittleness of the buds, but to translate it with darling, diletto, darling. He clearly thinks, okay, diletto is something more than simply caro, but darling is something more than simply dear, so I will use diletto, a slightly outdated term for my dear. Of course, if you look at the English and then look at the Italian, you think, okay. But if you look at the Italian, you immediately realize that nobody has ever said that, ever. No one on a train or anywhere has ever said, oh, you know, Rudi venti scuotono I diletti boccioli del maggio, which again, I know I'm now making fun of the Italian, but the translation is, has its use. If I want to decipher the English, I don't know English, or I'm using the translation to learn Shakespeare's English, that's good, that works. As a matter of fact, I'm now trying to teach myself Greek, very hard, and I'm trying to decipher at the moment the Iliad in just that manner. And I have found exactly that kind of translation, very good for what I'm trying to do. It's not Italian, but it's perfect as a sort of interlinear guide to the Greek. The other thing that we Italians do is we tend to heighten the register whenever we write. And you find examples of that everywhere, normally even on the vending machines. I don't know if there's anything here at Unistrasi, Back in Urbino we have machines with la macchinetta apparently informal, but that non eroga il resto. Non eroga. Why? Because clearly those who decided to put that sign in there thought, I can't write da. Da is obscene. It's almost a swear word, because if I'm talking to you, I can say no, non dà il resto, guarda. But if I'm writing this, I have to write non eroga il resto. Non si effettua servizio al tavolo. That sort of thing. So we Italians, as soon as we write, have been conditioned from infancy, mostly by, and I hear that things are still like that for most people, by our school teacher, primary school teachers, to think that when we are writing, we have to heighten the register, we have to use a lot of synonyms. If possible, we don't have to say, to write vedere, we have to write scorgere, even though scorgere is more specific. But it's more elegant, so we prefer that. School teachers, primary school teachers, keep saying their pupils never use fare, cosa, dire, or when you use dire, only use it once and then say rispondere, ribattere, ribadire, and so on. Which is why when you look, for instance, at the translation of novels in Italian, even non-classical novels, you will find that if it's from the English, in English you have he said, she said, they said, and in Italian you have disse, ribadì, rispose, controbatté, non so neanche se esiste controbatté, suona un po' tennis, ma that kind of thing. And thing, not good. Again, cosa non va bene, fare non va bene. Which of course may create problems in certain, when you're translating certain texts. When you translate, for instance, the modernists, I'm thinking of Virginia Woolf here, because this is the Virginia Woolf hall. Virginia Woolf, in her novels of the 20s up to The Waves, she wants to give you, by a very clever and very hard to follow use of basically free indirect thought. She wants to give you the impression that you are inside people's minds. And inside people's minds, the idea, the convention is that people don't think in specific terms, they think of quella cosa lì, quello là, and so on. So if the Italian translator heightens that, makes it more specific, or as has happened in the past, even turns a generic reference to a character into name and surname, that changes stuff. And you can do that. Again, I am absolutely amoral. Translation can be everything. But the problem is, once again, if you don't declare that you're doing that. And this is what happens basically in Mandalari. This is the other tendency. Mandalari translates Christa Wolf's very cold, clinical German, average, absolutely average, and sometimes almost scientific in diction, in register, into this very Tuscan, elegant Tuscan Italian, which is again feasible, but you have to tell me. Otherwise, I will ask myself, how did Christa Wolf write this? Maybe in some kind of, I don't know, I'm not an expert on German dialects, ancient Berlin dialect, I don't know. What is this in German? Now, finally, to come to what I've tried to do. I was under no illusion that mine would be the Chaucer translation. for various reasons. Even though, as I told you, I'm maybe the only thing in which I sort of trust myself to fully is translation. I don't know if I am anything else, if I am good at anything else, but maybe I'm wrong even there, but I trust my powers as a translator. So it's not a question of modesty. It's just realism. I knew that mine would only be one Chaucer translation, and that it would be necessary to state what kind of translation it was. And so I knew the other translations. By the way, I translated Chaucer much in the same way as people were making bread during lockdown. That was my activity. I was lucky or unlucky enough to have done all my courses at Urbino in the first semester that year. Was it 2020? I can't remember. 2020, I think. And so in the second semester, when spring was coming out and we were forbidden to go out with spring, I was translating the prologues and epilogues to the Canterbury Tales. I had already decided to read all of Chaucer. I had never done that. Once again, I had found Chaucer, and in particular Canterbury Tales, magnificent, and the Canterbury Tales incredibly funny, comic, and possessing and displaying a form of irony that is not normally associated with pre-modern times. By the way, this in itself is contentious. There are people who do not think that the Canterbury Tales are ironic. So even before I start translating, and I mean ironic not in the sense of fun, they clearly are meant to be funny, because there are, for instance, stories in which one character is made to eat another character, a male character is made to eat another male character's arsehole in the dark, in the half darkness. So there's that kind of comedy, factual comedy, situational comedy. But there is also, to me, linguistic irony, saying something in order to mean something else. I'm using irony in this restricted sense, and not all readers of Chaucer agree on that. So even before writing, even my reading was personal. I realized that even before I put pen to paper, and in that case it was pen to paper, because part of the therapy for lockdown was the fact of sitting in my balcony, in one of our balconies, and one of our balconies sounds very grand, sorry. We happen to have two balconies. In a balcony, on a balcony, and writing my translation by pen, with a pen on paper. I suppose, again, making bread, making stuff with one's hands felt good at the time. So even before I did, anyway, even before I set pen to paper, my very idea of Chaucer was contentious. And I knew, of course, that I wanted to give readers just that, to put an emphasis on just that side of Chaucer and of the Canterbury Tales, as I saw it. Therefore, I knew I needed to say that, and to say why, in my mind, it was not there in the other translations, which is what I'm repeating to you now. The other translations were mostly in prose, and as I will briefly show, a lot of Chaucer's irony and fun, as I read them, are specifically linked to the medium of verse, and particularly to that click that is given by rhyme. The punchline, as it were, is closed down by the rhyme quite often. So it needs to be in verse in order for that particular kind of humor to be understood. Again, as I read it. So all the other translation, bar one, were in prose. The only translation of all of Chaucer in verse had been published in the 90s, and it was, I don't think the translator is dead, so in this case I have to sort of contravene what I said earlier. It was rather bad. It was full of, I say this for those who are trying to do something in verse tomorrow, it was full of quelle che in italiano chiameremmo rime telefonate. Le rime con gli infiniti, le rime coi participi, in order to keep both the meter and the rhyme. The rhymes were quite often very obvious, which of course destroys the humor, because the rhyme has to be at least slightly unexpected in order to create that sense of something closing down, the jaws of the humor crocodile closing on the victim. And the other thing that I wanted to give an account of was Chaucer's incredible ability, which is also in different ways Dante's incredible ability and Shakespeare's incredible ability to tell a story or to make people talk fluently in verse, which is something that's very hard to do, and there was, to me, no Italian translation that did that, because the only poetic translation was, again, there were also a lot of lines which did not scan properly. The problem, of course, in that case was that the translator had decided to do the whole of Chaucer in verse and rhyme, which is incredible. If I had to do the whole of Chaucer in this manner, I would need a couple of lives at least. I did not even do the whole of the Canterbury Tales, I just did the prologues and the epilogues. Versions in prose are good enough in their way, in the sense that, for instance, this is something that Barbero, the historian, says. He says he prefers Italian translations of medieval literature that are in prose. He himself translated a number of obscene, of bawdy French fabliaux in prose, and the sources were in verse and in rhyme. Because he thinks that it's impossible to give contemporary Italian readers a sense of why the foreign author would need verse, and how he or she, normally he, would use it to tell a story. And he has a point, of course, and for certain uses, I appreciate that the translations in prose are better. If you want to just read the stories and have the same details, factual, lexical details, that are there in the English, the Middle English, the translations in prose are often better than mine. So again, I would not read my own. If I wanted to decipher Chaucer, I would read theirs. If, however, you want to have a sense of how Chaucer's works in terms of, again, rhyme, verse, and humor, I think mine works better because of what it attempts to do. Sorry, someone just stood up and I got distracted, but I'm going to go back to my point. I thought that I had to declare that. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is, again, and this also justifies all the translators, or most of the translators, who do not actually declare what they're doing. The reason why they do that again, is that readers don't want to know. They want to think I'm reading the source. And therefore, if readers don't want to know, translators, who are themselves readers, know this. And they also know that publishers won't like it. Publishers like very few things less than a translator going on about how he translated something. So you have to sort of slip it in the introduction. And I think I managed to do that. And I'm doing that with Dickens now, but you have to sort of make it pass inside a series of considerations on the style of the source. You say, okay, this works like this, and that is why I decided to use this kind of language very briefly, and as if you're not really doing that, you can get away with it. But it's getting away with it. So I'm not criticizing even the translators for not saying, I translated this in this manner, for not publishing declarative translations. I'm just saying this is how the world works. So when the world works like that, you either are powerful enough to do things your own way, and that's clearly not my case, or you try to do them all the same, and try to get away with it, try to slip the piece of information you want to give people, give readers in this case, somewhere in the introduction. Okay, I have to change my file now. Now, since this is all very theoretical, I'd like to give you a taste of what I tried to do. In order to do that, I have to specify that I had to take a number of decisions. I wanted to write in a formal meter, and I wanted to write in rhyme, more or less. But I decided that, well, my formal meter would be close to Chaucer's meter. Actually, it's close to the model of Chaucer's meter, because by the end of his career, Chaucer, who had begun writing and translating by following French models and using in particular an 8-syllable line or a 6- and 8-syllable line that he found in the French ballads. By the end of his career, he was writing in an Italian mode. So his models and the books he translated from were mostly Italian, Boccaccio, as I told you. He translates from Boccaccio a lot. By the way, the Canterbury Tales translated into Italian in prose, of course, shift them in Decameron territory. At that point, they look like the Decameron, which is perfectly feasible, sensible, and right, as long as people know, no problem. So by the end of his career, he was writing in this sort of 10, 11 syllable line, which was clearly modeled on the Italian endecasyllable. Therefore, that was easy enough. I thought, okay, let's use hendecasyllables. Which kind of hendecasyllable? Not so simple in the sense that I'm not a poet. So again, it was lockdown, so I had slightly more time than usual on my hands. So I decided to study the endecasyllable from Dante to the 19th century, and to study all the possible stress models, because of course stress cannot fall on just any syllable if you want the poetry to read as poetry. For instance, the 5th syllable is very rarely stressed, and the stress on the 5th syllable is very modern and experimental. So I only have 3 5th syllable stresses in all of my translation, because I could not do otherwise. I did not find an alternative solution. But as for the rest, I avoided that. The other thing I tried to do is I tried to vary my stresses as much as possible without turning this into complete prose. I changed the translation a number of times, and then I had to wait because I could no longer understand anything about it, about the flow in particular. But I did not want it to sound too poetic. I wanted it to sound like prose in verse, as it were. Because Chaucer, even though we don't know what Chaucer actually sounded like, and I'm not going to attempt reading this in Middle English because I'm a very bad Middle English reader, and I don't want to risk it just in case there are colleagues online who may hear my Middle English accent, so I will normalize it in English. We will work like that here. So we don't know how Chaucer read his lines aloud. We assume that the Canterbury Tales were mostly read aloud. We don't know how they sounded. But you sort of see that it does not scan as smoothly as Dryden or even Shakespeare. Even modern English poetry does not scan in a completely smooth manner until the 17th century. For instance, iambic pentameter today normally has a stress on the fourth syllable, but that sort of got systematized during the 16th century. Wyatt, for instance, did just anything, whereas Surrey tended to have that accent at least, that stress at least, which makes the line more regular. Anyway, so I studied accentual models for the hendecassyllable. I decided not to make it too poetic, which meant, of course, not going to iambic. Because the risk, of course, you have, if you have 11 syllables and the last one is not stressed, the risk is that you will tend to put stresses on the second, the fourth, the sixth, the eighth, etc. Amor canullo amato, amar perdona. That kind of thing. Amor canullo amato, amar perdona. It's very nice to have one line like that, but if it's all like that, it becomes a nursery rhyme. And if you're telling a story and you're trying to be funny, I thought that's not good. It's not good in general. You have to vary your rhythms, but in particular with Chaucer, I thought I have to vary this. The other thing is that it is rather paradoxical. I decided to use rhyme also because I thought rhyme is one of Chaucer's main comedic, again, in my reading, ploys, comedic instruments. But actually, I decided that I was to have no obvious rhymes, or as few as possible, no rhymes between infinitives and so on. And possibly, as much as possible, I wanted noun to rhyme with verb, etc. Or if it was two nouns or two verbs, nouns and verbs which would not be obvious, because the rhyme has to add something, I thought. But paradoxically, I did not want to use perfect full rhymes all the time, because I also thought, well, full rhymes in Italian are very easy, much easier in a way than in English. And that means that they risk being a bit too obvious and too obtrusive. So most of the time, or a lot of the time, I decided to use slant rhymes, assonance and consonants, rather than full rhyme. Again, I'm not trying to justify this. I'm just giving you the bricks and the yardstick on which I wish the translation, against which I wish the translation to be judged. So just an example of what I mean by writing. Yes, just one example, because we're not going to have time for more than that. What I mean by humor in verse and rhyme. Again, I'm reading this in modern English, more or less. There was also a nun, a prioress. This is, of course, the general prologue. The nun is, well, we tend to think of nuns as religious people, and Chaucer did too, but of course, a prioress in Chaucer's time would also have been a lady of some sort. And so, to me, this is a slightly humorous, ironic description of someone who likes to show that she is refined and has been and well-bred, refined and well-bred. There was also a nun, a prioress, that of her smiling was full, simple, and coy. Her greatest oath was but by Saint Loy, very delicate. And she was clipped, she was named Madame Eglantine. Full well she sang the service divine, entombed in her nose full simile. Again, the idea is that if you are intoning with your nose, you are refined, you're using a thin voice. You're not talking with a full tenor voice or bass voice. And French, she spoke full fair and fetishly. Basically, this is a mere doubling. She spoke French well. After the school of Stratford at the Bow, at the Bow, actually, for French of Paris was to her unknown. So this is a typical example of what Chaucer does. At least I read it again as a typical example, because the problem with irony is that you can never demonstrate that it's there. Try as you may, you can never demonstrate that it is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of a good fortune must be in search of a wife. I immediately hear that as ironic. It's of course the beginning of Austen's Pride and Prejudice, but some people do not read it as ironic. And there's no way of demonstrating that something is ironic, because something ironic is something which means something different from what it appears to mean. So I read that as ironic in the sense that Chaucer has been presenting this character as very refined and wishing to show that she is refined. And of course, knowing French would be or is another element of that refinement. But Chaucer tells us, and he tells us in verse and with the rhyme, that, well, actually she speaks very good French, but it's the French of Stratford at Bow. As if we said, sì, parla un francese bellissimo, il francese di Pontedera. Okay? This is the idea. There was a school, but the implication is she never went to France. She's not that refined. She's not that kind of lady. And of course, to me, the rhyme between Bow and unknow is very funny because of that. Because she didn't know real French at all. And so I tried to do that in Italian. E poi c'era una suora, una priora, con un sorriso semplice e ritroso. Al massimo invocava Sant'Eligio. E lei si chiamava Madame Eglantina. Lei si chiamava perché prima ci sono degli altri versi che dicono e lui si chiamava così, eccetera. Cantava bene il servizio divino. By the way, the rhyme is rhyming couplets, mostly, not all of it, but you surely know that most of the Canterbury Tales, particularly the prologues and the epilogues, are in rhyming couplets. Cantava bene il servizio divino, con l'accento elegante, un po' di naso, e parlava uno splendido francese, ma della scuola di Stratford at Bow. La lingua di Parigi, invece, no. Okay, so what I tried to do is, again, give that sense that I'm not really judging her. Chaucer is not really judging her. He's giving us the elements to judge her. And putting that rhyme in there so that we recognize, okay, here is a woman with pretensions higher than what she actually has to offer in social terms. And I thought in Italian, if I put that no after a parenthetical, it would be more, it would work well. Okay, very quickly, another couple of examples. This second passage, it shall be done, etc., is the pardoner. The pardoner is one of the funniest characters in the Canterbury Tales. In his own prologue and story, after the general prologue, he goes on to describe all the methods by which he fools his parishioners in general, poor people, into buying his, or into paying him to make them touch his holy relics, etc. And he basically says to all the other pilgrims, this is all bosh, but people pay me because I'm very good at fooling them. And then he goes on to try and extort money from the pilgrims themselves and saying, come touch my relics, etc. Here, this is before he tells his story. He gets asked by the host to tell a story himself because the previous story was very sad. A young woman, a beautiful young woman, was killed. So he says, "I want a funny story. Come on, you can tell me a funny story." And he says, "It shall be done." Quote he, said he, by Saint Ronion, I suppose. But first, quote he, here at this ale stake, questa birreria, I will both drink and eat of a cake. But right anon, the gentiles gone to cry, the other people, the other pilgrims begin to cry out to protest. No, let him tell us of no ribaldry. Tell us some moral thing that we may learn some wit, and then will we gladly hear. Che ci racconti una cosa morale, un apologo morale, così impariamo anche qualcosa, siamo più contenti. And he answers, I grant you is okay, he says, but I must think upon some honest thing while that I drink. Okay, think, drink are united here. The rhyme is not difficult, is rather not obvious, but it's two verbs, two infinitives. So I allowed myself a rhyme between verbs in this case, but still I think that drinking and thinking are particularly significant in that case, and that it would be fun to put them into some correlation, in this case not thinking, but a sort of a concession on the part of the pardoner, che nel mio tenore dice va bene, se proprio devo, qualche cosa di onesto, prima bevo. Again, the use of full stops in order to prepare the full stops or commas in order to prepare the punchline is already known to you by now. The last passage I want to read to you, we still have a few minutes, and I said I would let you talk, and I didn't. So I lied at the beginning. I realize now I didn't know I was lying, so it was not actually a lie. I really thought. But I'm convinced that it's this kind of setup that leads me to go on and on and on as a typical academic. So sorry about that, but tomorrow you will have to work and to tell me things, and I will rest. One of the, to me, the funniest parts in the prologues and epilogues is when Chaucer himself appears, because Chaucer is one of the pilgrims. As a matter of fact, he begins telling the story homodiegetically in the first person, because he is there at the Tabard Inn at the beginning. And whenever he describes himself or other people talking about him, one of the funny elements of the Canterbury Tales is that he has other people talk about him as if he were a complete fool. And he also behaves and talks like an idiot. and does idiotic things like telling incredibly boring or stupid or badly written stories. He reserves for himself the worst piece of poetry in the whole of the Canterbury Tales. And this is the introduction, the host asking Chaucer to tell a story. Uncharacteristically, this is not in couplets, but it's in rhyme royal, which makes it more difficult. Rhyme royal is a sort of, it's very similar. It's a mixture between A-B lines and couplets. And it's very similar to how l'ottava rima di Ariosto, Tasso, etc. works. It's A-B, B, C, C. So you have A-B, but then the last B has a couplet, forms a couplet, so B, C, C, and so it's two couplets in the end. When all this miracle was said, every man as sober was that it was a wonder to see, till that our host began to jape, he began to a scherzare. Conosciamo tutti questo genere di personaggi che in compagnia fanno i pagliacci e coinvolgono gli altri prendendo in mezzo questo o quello. And then and of course he looks at Chaucer when he begins to do that, because he thinks, okay, who is the weakest link here? And then at first he looked upon me and said thus, what man art thou, quoth he? Thou lookst as if thou would find an hare. Sembra che stia stia dando la caccia alla lepre. Forever upon the ground I see thee stare. Dopodiché gli chiede di raccontare una storia in rima, ma mi fermo solo a questo per leggervi la mia traduzione per dirvi un paio di cose. Sentito quel miracolo, noi tutti rimanemmo in silenzio per un poco. Poi l'oste si rimise a fare il matto e per la prima volta mi guardò. By the way, I tried to avoid stresses in the fifth syllable, but I allowed myself to write in a way that Chaucer or any Italian contemporary of Chaucer would never have allowed themselves. I, for instance, ho usato finali tronchi, per esempio, o finali sdruccioli, cosa che Dante o Petrarca, cioè al massimo Petrarca avrebbe potuto farlo una volta per dirci quanto era un fenomeno, perché Petrarca ci teneva a dirci che riusciva a fare, non so, l'endecasillabo con 16 sillabe, che è possibile, sembra strano ma è possibile. Ma io mi sono permesso invece una forma di scrittura di fatto contemporanea. E l'altra cosa che ho deciso di fare, which I might have said, is an Italian that looks, yes, contemporary, but with no contemporary references, so that you can have the illusion that this is the Middle Ages, and at the same time, it's not the fake Middle Ages that to me it would sound like if I were using sub-Petrarchan Italian. E per la prima volta mi guardò, disse: che razza d'uomo sei? Di un po', sei venuto con noi per cacciar tassi? Ti ho visto, tieni sempre gli occhi bassi. Okay, here you notice another thing, which is why I would not use this translation, because I use tassi and not lepri, which changes absolutely nothing in pragmatic terms, in terms of the pragmatics of conversation. The host is making a joke here, is poking fun at Chaucer here. And there are badgers in medieval England, so not a problem. And of course you would have to look down to find them, very much down. But if I were reading this because I want to know what hare means, then the Italian would not tell me. So this is a translation that does something different from that. Finally, one last thing, really last thing. It's also very funny when Chaucer begins his tale in verse, the Sir Thopas, which is horrible. It's so horrible that it's funny. And of course, Chaucer, the writer, has the host stop Chaucer, the character, because he says, this is terrible, stop, tell another story. which is also very ironic in a different way. And I'm doing this because I wanted to hear, I'm reading this as well, because I wanted to end today's meeting, today's talk on a swear word, on a taboo word. No more of this, for God's dignity, said our host, for thou makest me so weary of thy very lewdness. Lewdness in this case does not mean oscenità, ma che non capisci niente, cioè la tua stupidità. La tua incapacità. That also wisely God my soul bless. Sto mescolando ormai inglese moderno, inglese medievale, non fateci caso. My ears ache after of thy drasty speech. Now such a rhyme the devil I beteach. This may well be rhyme doggerel, said he. Why so? Quod I, why wilt thou let me more of my tale than another man, since that it is the best rhyme I can? By God, quod he, for plainly at a word, thy drasty rhyming is not worth a tord. Turd, of course, is the same word we use in today's English, and I find it marvelous. This is not irony, this is just, to me, good fun, because the idea that che la poesia in cui sta a raccontare una storia Chaucer non è che non valga una merda, che sarebbe già poco bello, ma proprio uno stronzo, cioè l'oggetto. I find this marvelous. So as you can see on the right hand side of the page, I used exactly the word that describes the object. I think that's it. That's the best ending for the whole thing. I hope you had no need. I hope you had moderate fun, considering that this is still work or study or duty. But considering that this is work for me, I had moderate fun. So thank you.
And thank you, Massimiliano, for such an amazing seminar of introduction to a number of theories and themes, and also, lots of case studies that we're going to discuss tomorrow as well in our workshop. Some of the issues that you have tackled have been discussed in this class. You might remember Susan Basnet. We have just talked about the cultural turn in translation studies, and that's also the way in which I begin my translation studies course. And I think it's important as well to pinpoint a few issues that might come up as problematic, like the quotation you showed in the first slide.
Questo dice anche quanto ci eravamo coordinati per fare questa cosa.
Assolutamente. The idea of translation as manipulation, you remember we talked a lot about that, as the rewriting, as a transfer and a bridge, between different cultures, different languages, but as also this case study shows, also across time. And that was another issue that we started to talk about and start our reflection. That is, how do you translate, or which are the challenges at stake when you translate a text so distant in time? So not just, as you rightly pointed out, this is just Old English, Old Middle English. I mean, it's not the variety that we usually hear or read nowadays. So there are extra challenges on top of everything else. So the idea is exactly, how do I transfer, a number of meanings, or the style, or as you pointed out, the rhyme and rhyme scheme and all the background work that you need to do in order to really get into that, right? But also the idea of how do we transpose, for the contemporary target audience, that cultural system, which I am sure, was one of the challenges that you had in particular. Yeah.
Yes. Again, I didn't think I would be able to transfer the whole cultural system. So I just thought, okay, what is already there and what is not there? And I thought, again, because when we think of this kind of story, we think of Boccaccio, we don't have that idea that you can be funny and ironic in rhyme. So I wanted to do that, which was very medieval, because you told stories in rhyme mostly. So, okay, someone wanted to say something maybe.
Yeah, just any questions or
Comments,
comments?
insults.
Yeah, I was quite intrigued by the ending, the conclusion, which usually sets the tone for the whole for the whole speech about this conclusion on Swearton, which is really relevant, though, right? Swear word, you know,
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
an idiolect used by the characters in this context, isn't it?
Yeah, sì, adesso non so perché passo all'italiano, giusto per confondere l'uditorio, ma come dicevo prima, perché è una cosa che ho già detto prima in realtà, cioè questa è una cosa che capiamo perché è boccaccesca, cioè è letteralmente boccaccesca. Però appunto la storia del mugnaio, mi pare, sì, mugnaio, si conclude o quasi con un personaggio che viene ingannato e crede che l'ano di un altro personaggio, vedete che come mi sono censurato visto il luogo, l'ano di un altro personaggio sia la bocca della sua amata, c'è poca luce, eccetera. Quindi questa è una cosa che può passare anche in prosa, cioè è una cosa che c'è bene o male in Boccaccio, c'è nei fabliaux francesi che sono in rima, ma da noi sono tradotti in prosa, quindi l'idea che nel Medioevo ci fosse molta meno pruderie di quella che abbiamo noi, che crediamo di essere molto emancipati. Se non la sappiamo noi ce la dice continuamente Barbero, quindi ormai è nota la cosa. Secondo me invece la cosa che è più scandalosa e più difficile da capire è veramente il sistema letterario, cioè quello secondo me per un italiano è abbastanza alieno, anche se abbiamo Dante, che è curioso, perché Dante è in effetti, è un'altra storia, ma è quella cosa lì, cioè in Dante come era ed ebbe del suo cul fatto trombetta, cioè in Dante nell'inferno che è commedia, quindi è basso, quella roba lì c'è in versi.
In versi, certamente. Un'altra domanda, in realtà, che passo anche all'italiano, che un pochino ci consente anche di aprire delle premesse per domani e in generale anche poi per i prossimi workshop e per i prossimi testi sui quali lavoreremo. Ovvero tu hai tradotto direttamente dall'Old English, no? Quindi dal testo, cioè che vediamo nella contrapposizione. A tuo avviso, no? Cercare di ragionare invece su un testo che sia stato già tradotto su un inglese moderno e poi reso in italiano, può essere considerato come una specie di tradimento del testo originale o può rientrare invece in una scelta precisa da parte del traduttore?
Io ho già detto che sono completamente amorale, quindi di tradimento non parlo di sicuro. Ma sono amorale
Perché di fedeltà e tradimenti abbiamo già parlato anche l'altro giorno scherzando con gli studenti, no? Del fatto che spesso si parla, quando si parla di traduzione fedele o infedele rispetto ad un testo, in realtà chiaramente sono terminologie un po' romantiche, no?
Sì, in realtà è una roba che nasce, la fermo subito perché qui potrebbe partire la famosa lezione temibile di un'ora e mezza, è una roba che nasce con gli umanisti, cioè nasce con la Bibbia, nasce con i testi sacri, perché chiaramente se mi stai traducendo, se io ti dico che questo testo è sacro, poi ti devo dire che anche la traduzione è sacra, quindi devo trovare dei giochini mentali. Per esempio ti dirò che ho messo 70 traduttori in 70 stanze diverse, gli ho fatto tradurre tutta la Bibbia ebraica a ognuno di loro, che era più comodo farne fare un pezzo, ma io ho voluto farlo così, e guarda te, tutti e 70 hanno fatto la stessa identica traduzione. Perché? Perché erano ispirati da Dio. Cioè devo trovare il modo per dirti, la traduzione è il testo di partenza. In questa cosa in realtà che poi passa con gli umanisti ai testi non sacri, cioè Leonardo Bruni dice Aristotele per me, sto semplificando, ma è sacro, quindi lo devo tradurre alla perfezione. In questa cosa, sempre in quel periodo lì nasce, cioè a questa cosa si collega il fatto che non va più bene fare quello che tutti hanno fatto per tutti i secoli dei secoli, cioè tradurre per esempio, se non so il greco, un testo greco dal latino o dall'arabo. È sempre successo, però quando passa l'idea che il testo di partenza, che in quel caso viene chiamato originale, è sacro, allora non va neanche più bene non andare direttamente al testo di partenza. È una cosa che noi, senza saperlo, pensiamo ancora. nasce appunto dal tardo medioevo, dall'umanesimo e così via, per cui anche in Inghilterra dal tardo 500 in poi si comincia a dire, beh no, però se traduci dal greco devi tradurre il greco. Io per esempio trovavo, pur sapendo l'inglese, sapendo leggere Shakespeare, quando si è fatto, non so se non c'eri dentro anche tu, nello Shakespeareone in 3 volumi della... Vabbè, a me mi hanno infilato dentro io volevo fare i sonetti, dissi adesso non mi viene in mente il nome, dissi guarda io farei tanto volentieri i sonetti, benissimo, fai Much Ado About Nothing. Ok, faccio Much Ado About Nothing, sentendomi il bambino degli schiaffoni. Faccio i sonetti, però prima di fare Much Ado About Nothing avevo già fatto un po' di sonetti, perché volevo dire guarda farei volentieri i sonetti, ne ho già fatti un po'. E francamente era utilissimo Serpieri, perché Serpieri è filologicamente precisissimo, ha 2-3 etti di note per sonetto, e quindi ero sicuro che se seguivo lui non sbagliavo, ovviamente avevo in mente anche l'inglese, ma paradossalmente uno potrebbe usare Serpieri per scrivere i sonetti di Shakespeare in italiano usando Serpieri come base, quindi tutto si può fare, cioè purché funzioni dal mio punto di vista. Poi se invece mi dici questa cosa è accettata in società, lo diceva Masolino D'Amico, che lui aveva usato altre traduzioni, traduceva da altre traduzioni, ma sai era Masolino D'Amico può dire quel che gli pare.
Va bene, allora ti ringrazio tantissimo, io aspetto tutti e tutte domattina alle ore 10 in punto, saremo in quest'aula e avvieremo il workshop, quindi portate un computer, voglia di lavorare e un dizionario monolingue possibilmente anche online. Quindi una buona serata.
Domani vi tocca partecipare, perché
domani
vengo a rompere le balle direttamente.
E ringraziamo ancora Massimiliano Morini, grazie per questa splendida lezione, ringrazio anche chi ci ha seguito in streaming e una buona serata.